The camera lights flickered on. The Capitol Hill Judicial Oversight Committee chamber was full, not just with lawmakers and aides, but with television crews, reporters, and quietly whispering observers. The whole scene had the air of something much bigger than a routine hearing. Live feeds from CNN, MSNBC, BBC, and even Al Jazeera scrolled across screens in homes and offices around the world. Something was about to happen, and everyone could feel it. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat at the center of the panel, her face calm, her body still. In front of her lay a leather-bound folder neatly stacked with documents, notes, and citations. Her hands rested gently on the table, fingers interlaced. She had done this before many times, but today felt different. Even she could feel it in the air. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, fiery, sharp-tongued, and known for not holding back. She leaned forward, her pen tapping softly against her notes. She didn't look away from Barrett, not once. This wasn't just another legal review. It was political, was personal. Justice Barrett, Crockett said, leaning closer into the microphone. You've spoken often about judicial neutrality, but can you explain how neutrality applies when the court systematically sides with executive power? Barrett smiled, slightly, keeping her voice even. Congresswoman, the role of the court is not to choose sides, but to interpret the law. Each case, but your recent decision on the Homeland Surveillance Act was that neutrality. Crockett cut in, voice rising just enough to turn heads. Barrett paused. She looked at the committee chair, then back at Crockett. Her response was steady. As I was saying, each case is examined based on constitutional grounding, not political implications. The room was already buzzing. Reporters typed rapidly. Staffers exchanged glances. But it wasn't just the words. It was the feeling like pressure building before a storm. Crockett raised a paper from her folder. Then perhaps you can explain this internal memo from your chambers, dated last November before the case even made it to the docket. Barrett's gaze didn't shift, but her hands moved just slightly. A twitch. A reaction. I'm not here to answer about internal discussions. That memo is confidential and out of the committee's jurisdiction, she said calmly. Crockett smiled, but it wasn't friendly. With all due respect, Madame Justice, the people deserve to know whether the highest court is shaping outcomes. Behind closed doors, murmurs echoed through the chamber. Cameras zoomed in. The CNN anchor whispered into his mic, "Things are heating up." Barrett inhaled slowly, but before she could respond, Crockett interrupted again. "You're here under oath. I believe you owe this committee a straight answer." And then it happened. Barrett slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Crockett. Her tone was still polite, still professional. But something in her voice cut through the noise like a knife through glass. "Please allow me to finish," she said firmly. "I respectfully ask you to be quiet until I complete my answer." The room went dead silent. The click of a dropped pen echoed from the far corner. A few audible gasps filled the space. Even the camera crew froze, unsure whether to pan out or zoom closer. No one expected it. Justice Barrett, known for her caution, her almost cold control, had just silenced a sitting congresswoman. On live television. Crockett blinked. She wasn't used to being shut down, especially not in public. Especially not like this. Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. For a moment, she simply stared. Barrett looked away and calmly resumed her statement. "As I said, Congresswoman, my duty is to the Constitution. The memo you referenced was an early draft written by a clerk. It has no legal authority and was not used to determine our ruling." The chair tried to step in, but the tension in the room wouldn't allow it. The committee was no longer in control. This was no longer a standard hearing. It had become something else's showdown between two women standing on opposite ends of law and power. Outside, Twitter lit up like wildfire. Hashtag Barrett vs. Crockett hashtag. She silenced her hashtag Live Justice Showdown opinion pieces were drafted in real time. Anchors called it the most explosive courtroom-style moment in congressional history. In a newsroom across town, a producer from a major network slammed his fist on the desk and shouted, "Cut the tape. This is tonight's headline." Meanwhile, in the hallway just outside the chamber, aides scrambled. Phones buzzed with texts from the White House, from the Pentagon, even from foreign embassies. "What the hell just happened?" one advisor muttered. Back inside, Barrett closed her folder and looked straight ahead. Crockett sat upright, eyes locked on the back wall, expression unreadable. No one said anything. The hearing wasn't over, but nothing that followed would matter as much as what had just happened. A Supreme Court justice had told a sitting Congresswoman in live national television to be quiet. And for once, she had listened. But behind the silence, something had shifted. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The hearing resumed, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had started as a dry legal discussion on constitutional checks and balances had become a spectacle one with real political weight. Pundits on television were already calling it the most electrifying oversight session since Watergate. But inside the Capitol, the players weren't finished. Not by a long shot. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still for a moment after Barrett's blunt remark. Her pride was wounded but not broken. She had never been one to back down, and she wouldn't start now, not in front of cameras, not in front of the justice who had just silenced her. Aides at her side whispered notes and suggestions, but she waved them off. Her eyes were fixed on Barrett like a hunter waiting for the perfect moment. "Madame Justice," she began again, her voice cooler now, more measured. "I didn't realize the highest court in the land needed shielding from hard questions." It was a line made for headlines. Journalists' fingers raced across keyboards. The line echoed instantly across social media, quoted and clipped with millions of views within minutes. Barrett didn't blink. She looked straight ahead, face composed, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. She knew what Crockett was doing, reframing the moment to her advantage. Painting herself as the voice of accountability and Barrett as the untouchable elite. Still, Barrett responded, "It's not shielding, Congresswoman. It's process. I was invited here to testify. I expect to be allowed to do so without interruption." The committee chair leaned forward and tried to steer things back on track. "Let's remember," he said, "this is a hearing, not a courtroom. Everyone will have a chance to speak." But it was too late. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own. As Barrett answered more questions, most of them now dry and procedural, Crockett waited. She wasn't done. And deep down, Barrett knew it. In a hallway below the chamber, two Department of Justice liaisons whispered quietly as they watched the feed on a tablet. "Is this what the administration wanted?" one asked. The other replied, "They wanted fireworks." They got napalm. International reaction was already forming. In Brussels, a European diplomat commented to Reuters, "This kind of public friction between branches of the U.S. government is ... unusual, tense, and telling." Back in the chamber, Crockett dropped her next card. "Justice Barrett, would you be willing to share your communications with external advisors regarding the Homeland Surveillance Act decision?" Barrett tilted her head. "Those communications fall under judicial confidentiality protections." Crockett smiled thinly. "So you admit there were communications?" Barrett blinked. "Every justice discusses cases with advisors. It's standard judicial practice." "Your insinuation." "I'm not insinuating," Crockett interrupted. "I'm asking if any of those communications involve private sector consultants tied to data mining firms." Now the room held its breath. This wasn't a theoretical question anymore. This was dangerous territory. Suggestions of collusion between Supreme Court justices and private intelligence companies. If proven, It could spark a constitutional crisis. Barrett responded cautiously. I cannot confirm or deny involvement with any private entity without evidence. If you have such evidence, I suggest you present it through the proper channels. Crockett leaned back in her seat, satisfied. She'd planted the idea. That was enough for now. The room buzzed again. Cable news crawlers across the bottom of the screen now read, Breaking Crockett questions Barrett on tech industry ties tension mounts in live Capitol hearing outside the Capitol. Protesters had already begun to gather. Some carried signs reading, We the people deserve transparency, while others had No More Secret Courts painted across cardboard. The confrontation was no longer just between two women. It had spilled into the streets. Back inside, Barrett held her ground. Congresswoman, the court's independence is one of the last safeguards of this republic. Undermining it with speculation erodes public trust. Crockett leaned forward again, and hiding behind tradition to avoid accountability erodes it faster. Another standoff, another silence. The committee chair called for a brief recess. The feed cut to commercial. Barrett gathered her papers and stood up. She didn't look at Crockett, but the tension between them remained like static in the air. The hearing resumed after the short recess, but it felt like a different world now. What had started as a routine check on judicial boundaries had spiraled into something far bigger, a live political confrontation with international elites eyes glued to every word. Justice Amy Coney Barrett returned to her seat with a calm face, but her knuckles were slightly white as she held her prepared notes. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, came back with a quiet fire behind her eyes. She wasn't done, not even close. Camera zoomed in the moment they sat down. Barrett adjusted her microphone. Crockett flipped through a stack of documents as if preparing to launch another missile. And in newsrooms across America, editors whispered instructions to stay live, don't cut away. The chairman cleared his throat. We now return to the matter of judicial conduct and national security rulings. That was the cue. Crockett leaned forward. Madame Justice, are you aware that your ruling on the Homeland Surveillance Act is being used as a legal foundation by two foreign governments to justify expanded citizen monitoring? Barrett blinked, her composure intact. Foreign governments interpret our rulings through their own legal frameworks. I am not responsible for how regimes in, say, Hungary or Egypt apply U.S. judicial logic. But that's the problem, isn't it? Crockett replied. We export legal precedent without accountability. And now journalists in two allied nations are in prison because their governments cited your majority opinion. A soft gasp rippled through the room. Barrett paused. That is tragic. But the role of this court is not to govern global consequences. We uphold the Constitution. Crockett didn't flinch. And what about the consequences here at home? The ruling dismantled key limits on government surveillance. There are reports, real ones, of minority communities being disproportionately tracked since the decision. Barrett's tone cooled. Congresswoman, you sit in a legislative body with the power to enact corrective measures. The court does not make policy, it interprets it. Outside the chamber, journalists scrambled to verify Crockett's claims. Within minutes, a live graphic appeared on CNN, breaking minority surveillance claims linked to Supreme Court ruling. Barrett's words had barely faded before Crockett fired again. I have a leaked email, Madame Justice, between a federal judge and a former DHS contractor. They claim your decision was directly influenced by a meeting at the American Legal Forum. A meeting you attended 2 weeks before oral arguments. Care to explain? Barrett sat upright. The room froze. I attend many forums. I do not take policy direction from any groups, certainly not ones with private sector affiliations. Crockett held up the printed email. It mentions your name specifically. It says, quote, Barrett signaled favor toward our position in pre-hearing talk. Barrett's voice dropped low and firm. That's an accusation, not a fact. I'd suggest extreme caution before you accuse a sitting justice of impropriety on national television. But the damage was already done. Reporters rushed out of the chamber. A special report went live on MSNBC within moments. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeGate and #Surveillanceleaks. At the White House, aides to the president were already drafting a response, unsure whether to defend the court or distance the administration from the unfolding chaos. And far away in a secure room in Tel Aviv, Mossad analysts watched the live stream closely. One turned to another and said, "If Crockett is right, U.S. intelligence architecture may be built on compromised legal ground." Inside the chamber, the committee chair tried again to calm things down. "Let's return to procedure," he said, voice tense. "We're here to evaluate checks and balances, not try a case." But neither Barrett nor Crockett was stepping back. Barrett inhaled deeply. "Congresswoman, do you believe this hearing is about oversight or spectacle?" Crockett smiled without warmth. "Both, because oversight without public accountability is just bureaucracy. Spectacle is the only way to force transparency in this political climate." Barrett narrowed her eyes. "Then you mistake drama for justice. Or maybe," Crockett said, "you mistake silence for wisdom." Another silence followed, thicker than before. It wasn't just drama now. It felt like a deep national wound had been opened. And nobody knew if it could be closed. One floor below, a junior producer for PBS texted her editor, "This is like watching the Constitution bleed on live TV." Outside, protests were growing. News helicopters captured the growing crowd, some chanting Crockett's name, others waving signs that said Barrett must resign. And then came the real shock. A committee aide rushed forward with a note. The chair read it and looked stunned. "We've just received word," he said slowly, "that a Senate Intelligence Subcommittee has called an emergency closed-door session regarding the contents of the leaked email." Gasps broke out again. Crockett sat back in her chair, satisfied. Barrett stayed frozen, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. Something irreversible had begun. The lines between law, politics, and public trust were blurring. Every second on air made this system look less stable, more fragile. And in that moment, with a nation watching and the world reacting, it was clear. This wasn't just a confrontation between two powerful women. It was a rupture in the image of American justice itself. The cameras kept rolling, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. The hearing room, once rigid and ceremonial, now felt like the center of an unfolding crisis. Justice Amy Coney Barrett sat composed, but her silence was heavier than before. Across from her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett quietly organized her notes. As if preparing for a second act even more intense than the first. Outside, the Capitol was surrounded by protesters. Some waved signs demanding justice for surveillance victims. Others called for Barrett's resignation. Reporters were broadcasting live, calling it the most explosive judicial confrontation in decades. Social media had gone into overdrive. Hashtags like #BarrettLeak, #JusticeOnTrial, and #Crockett, UNCHAINED were trending worldwide. Inside, the chairman cleared his throat again. "We remind all members that this is an official inquiry. Unsubstantiated allegations will be treated with serious consequence." But it was too late for warnings. The narrative was already out of control. Barrett leaned toward the mic. "If I may, I would like to respond clearly to the implication made earlier. I have never, in my capacity as a Supreme Court justice, discussed a pending case in any forum public. Or Private Crockett didn't interrupt this time. She waited." Barrett continued, "The American Legal Forum is a think tank. I spoke there on the general importance of judicial independence. Any claims otherwise are politically motivated and dangerously misleading." Crockett replied, carefully choosing her words. "If that is the case, Then you won't mind us subpoenaing full correspondence between yourself and members of the forum over the last 6 months. A stunned murmur filled the room. Barrett raised an eyebrow. I will comply with any lawful request. But Congress must remember the separation of powers exists for a reason. Now, it wasn't just about one ruling. It had become a constitutional standoff. The tension wasn't theoretical anymore, it was operational. People were watching to see whether America's legal system could even handle this kind of rupture. Suddenly, a voice broke in from the side of the chamber. A staffer handed a phone to the chairman with a shaken expression. The chairman read something on the screen. His jaw tightened. Then he looked up and said, "We've just received classified confirmation from the Senate Intelligence Subcommittee. The email presented earlier by Congresswoman Crockett is authentic." Gasps again. Crockett pressed forward, like a prosecutor in closing arguments. "So we now know that prior to your ruling on the Homeland Surveillance Act, there were private conversations between you and members of a think tank with government contracts. Doesn't that undermine the very neutrality the judiciary is supposed to protect?" Barrett didn't blink. "That email does not confirm a conversation. It reflects an interpretation. And if this committee intends to indict justices based on what others say about them, we are entering dangerous territory." The chairman tried to intervene. Let's remain civil, but the damage was done. The confrontation had escalated into a crisis of legitimacy. Backstage, two international reporters whispered to each other in French. "This will be front page. Everywhere. Not just politics, it's about power, control, surveillance. Even Europe will react." Meanwhile, in the Situation Room at the White House, the president was being briefed. A national security advisor said plainly, "Sir, if this continues, it will erode our legal credibility abroad. Foreign intelligence services are already spinning this as judicial corruption." The president didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Get me a call with the Chief Justice today." Back in the hearing room, Crockett dropped another surprise. "Madam Justice, I'd also like to enter in to record a 2023 memo from a former intelligence advisor. It states that your court surveillance ruling enabled an algorithm now used by the FBI without public oversight. Can you confirm if you were aware of this outcome?" Barrett looked down for the first time. "I rule on constitutionality," she said. "Not on operational implementation. That is not the job of the court." "But isn't that the problem?" Crockett replied. "No one is accountable." The recess only lasted 8 minutes, but it felt like an hour. Security tightened. Extra personnel entered the hearing room, standing along the walls in plain sight. The audience returned to their seats. The mood had changed, less like a government oversight meeting, more like a live countdown to a political explosion. Justice Amy Coney Barrett re-entered calmly, holding a thick manila folder. She passed it to her legal advisor, whispered something, and took her seat. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat still, chin slightly lifted. She hadn't moved since the recess began. Her team passed her a new document, one not part of the official case file. Her eyes scanned it quickly. Then, without a word, she placed it face down on the table. The chairman rapped the gavel. "Hearing is back in session. We will now continue questioning." Crockett spoke first. "Madam Justice, I want to clarify something. Do you acknowledge any conflict of interest in delivering rulings that directly benefit the Department of Homeland Security's expanded surveillance capabilities?" Barrett responded, her voice calm but firm. "I stated earlier, I rule on the law. If Congress chooses to expand federal powers, it is within my role to interpret the constitutionality, not the politics, of that decision." Crockett leaned forward. "But would you say it's appropriate to meet with representatives from private intelligence contractors, even unofficially, during the lead-up to such rulings?" Barrett paused. "If you are referring to the American Legal Forum again, I have had no private meetings with intelligence contractors directly or indirectly." Now it was Crockett's turn to drop the bomb. I'd like to submit into the official record an internal calendar obtained through a protected whistleblower. Channels showing that 3 weeks before the ruling, you attended a closed-door dinner at the Langston Institute. Present at that dinner, former DNI staff, a sitting NSA contractor, and the director of Sentinel AIA firm awarded a data processing contract after your court's decision. The chairman looked stunned. Congresswoman, are you confirming the calendar's authenticity? Yes, verified against flight logs and hotel security logs. Justice Barrett flew in under U.S. Marshal protection. The event wasn't disclosed on her public itinerary. Barrett's face tightened slightly, but her voice remained even. That dinner was part of a lecture series. I spoke on constitutional history. No case was discussed. Crockett didn't blink. Even the appearance of conflict undermines judicial confidence. You know that. At that moment, the CNN and Al Jazeera news tickers lit up with breaking headlines. Confirmed. Barrett attended private dinner with intelligence figures ahead of ruling. Barrett turned to the chairman. Request this committee respect boundaries. Accusations without context threaten not just individuals but institutions. But the narrative had already spun out. Meanwhile, in a side chamber, a staffer rushed to a private phone line. She just used the whistleblower archive. She plays the video, everything changes. Back inside the main room, Crockett opened her laptop. I asked for permission to present a short, time-stamped video recorded by a former Sentinel AI contractor. The whistleblower alleges that during the Langston dinner, constitutional vulnerability zones were openly discussed in relation to upcoming court trends. Barrett's hands were still on the table, but her eyes flickered. The chairman hesitated. Is this classified? No, already cleared by legal counsel for public viewing. Permission was granted. The room darkened slightly as the screen lit up. The video was grainy. Private dining room, low lighting, laughter, clinking glasses. The audio was clearer. Male voice. She won't give specifics. But the way she framed it, Section 702 is about to be seen through a national security lens. That's good for us. Another voice, so she's hinting. First voice again. Not directly, but you know how these dinners work. Soft alignment. The video stopped. Barrett finally spoke. That clip is deeply misleading. I did not engage in any legal conversation. And I had no idea the dinner would include those individuals. Crockett followed up immediately. But you stayed, you spoke, and you ruled. Silence. Barrett answered in a measured tone. I stayed because I was invited to speak on constitutional frameworks. If someone else chose to interpret my words politically, that is not my responsibility. But the impact had landed. It wasn't just what was said, but what it represented. A high court justice operating in blurred spaces, strategic dinners, quiet influence. The kind of thing Americans assumed happened elsewhere in corrupt democracies, in fragile states. Not here. A young journalist from The Guardian tweeted, "This hearing has moved beyond confrontation. This is systemic unraveling." Then, from the rear of the room, a voice rose. My name is Nathan Greer. I was the Sentinel AI contractor who made that recording. All eyes turned. A man stood, early 40s, wearing a dark blazer, his face pale but determined. I want to testify under oath. I saw metadata plans tied directly to the Supreme Court ruling. They called it Project Black Echo. It's not just surveillance. It's predictive policing using constitutional loopholes. The chairman froze. Barrett's expression didn't change, but her hands clenched slightly. Crockett stood. We'll need to swear him in. A Capitol Marshal brought over a Bible. Justice Barrett looked away for the first time in the hearing. And the whole world held its breath. The cameras were still rolling, but now no one was watching the clock. Nathan Greer, the Sentinel AI contractor turned whistleblower, sat down at the witness table. His hands trembled slightly as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. Behind him, the courtroom was dead silent, reporters frozen mid-keystroke. Aides whispering into earpieces, viewers at home leaning forward. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's voice was steady. "Mr. Greer, please tell this committee exactly what Project Black Echo is." Greer cleared his throat. Project Black Echo is an experimental domestic surveillance protocol developed by Sentinel AI in partnership with federal agencies. It uses layered metadata from cell networks, search engines, and predictive behavior modeling to forecast potential constitutional threats. A murmur rippled across the room. Crockett leaned in. "And what do you mean by constitutional threats?" "People whose speech, organizing, or digital patterns suggest challenges to federal authorities, especially those tied to protests, whistleblower networks, or judicial criticism. It's a risk flag system, not for crime, but for dissent." The chairman interjected. "Mr. Greer, are you claiming this system was greenlit by a Supreme Court ruling?" Greer nodded. Section 702 expansion allowed passive collection of non-criminal behavior under the label of foreign influence. The court's interpretation allowed domestic data to be swept up as long as it passed through any foreign server. This gave Sentinel AI legal cover. Jasmine Crockett didn't hesitate. "And what role, if any, did Justice Amy Coney Barrett play in all of this?" Greer looked directly at Barrett. "At the Langston dinner, she never said Black Echo, but she used specific language about judicial momentum favoring proactive security architecture." One of Sentinel's executives said afterward, and I quote, "We just got the nod." The room tensed. Cameras zoomed in on Barrett's face. She remained composed, but the public image of untouchable judicial neutrality had cracked. Barrett spoke carefully. "That is hearsay. This court does not rule by nods. I have never knowingly endorsed any surveillance program, let alone one targeting dissent." Crockett turned back to Greer. "Why come forward now?" Greer answered softly, "Because it's already active. I saw the early targeting logs, journalists, organizers. A Supreme Court ruling opened the door in the system." Walk through, suddenly. From behind the hearing chamber, a commotion. Security guards rushed toward a hallway. A woman in a dark blue suit was shouting, "I have the files. I have the internal Sentinel memos." Crockett looked up. "Who is that?" Greer stood. "That's Ellie Zhang. She was head of data compliance. She turned over the logs to me. If she has, the memos, they proved top-down coordination." Security allowed Ellie in. Her face was flushed, her hand clutching a thick folder. "I couldn't stay quiet," she said breathlessly. "I was part of the redaction team." These memos show conversations between Sentinel legal counsel and outside consultants predicting how Justice Barrett's language could be interpreted to justify metadata collection. They literally celebrated the ruling the day it dropped. Crockett reached for the file. The chairman hesitated. "Is this document cleared for public entry?" Ellie spoke clearly. "The documents are redacted under whistleblower protection law, and they are real." The chairman nodded. "Enter them into the record." Justice Barrett sat perfectly still, but her eyes were locked on the folder, unblinking. And then the room changed again. A voice came through a small speaker directly from a news desk. "This is a breaking report. European Union officials are demanding an emergency review of U.S. data sharing protocols after tonight's revelations. Berlin, Brussels, and Paris have all summoned U.S. ambassadors. One official calls it a fundamental breach of democratic norms, international fallout, real-time." Crockett stood. "This is no longer about partisan politics or judicial temperament. This is about the integrity of our institutions and whether unelected power has become too comfortable operating in the dark." Barrett slowly rose from her chair. The sun had not yet risen over Washington, but the Capitol was already surrounded by a sea of people pressers, journalists, security forces, helicopters hovered low. The energy in the air was no longer just political. It felt historic. Sighed. Room 7B of the Oversight Committee had transformed into something that looked more like a crisis command center than a congressional hearing. Screens displayed live feeds from Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. EU ambassadors were demanding clarification. Allies were rattled. Intelligence sharing pacts were on the verge of suspension. Justice Amy Coney Barrett stood by a side door, waiting to re-enter the chamber. Her aides flanked her, but remained silent. Overnight, she had become the symbol of something far larger than herself, an entire system of unchecked judicial interpretation wrapped in opaque legal language and protected by decades of institutional immunity. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, reviewed the contents of Ellie Jung's folder one more time. The documents were devastating mails, internal slides, even a recorded meeting summary referring to the Barrett Clause as legal coverage for metadata-based dissent. Profiling. It was chilling and clear. At 7:01 a.m., the session resumed. The chairman opened, due to the magnitude of the revelations. This hearing is being broadcast simultaneously on international channels. All members have been advised to refrain from speculative commentary. Let's begin. Justice Barrett requested the floor. I've served this nation with fidelity and intellectual honesty, she began. I did not authorize surveillance. I did not consult with Sentinel AI, but I do acknowledge that language in our rulings can be interpreted far beyond their intended scope. That is a flaw not just in law but in process. Crockett leaned forward. With respect, Justice Barrett, interpretation is not a glitch, it's a feature. Words from that bench become policy. You know that? Barrett looked her in the eye. And yet, you sit here with full authority to question me. That's democracy working, even in conflict. The audience was silent. Then came the moment that would define the hearing and perhaps history. Jasmine Crockett submitted a formal motion. This committee moves to recommend the formation of a bipartisan judicial ethics commission, equipped with subpoena power and bound by public oversight to evaluate all third-party legal interpretations that result in national security implementation. The chairman paused. This would be the first time a sitting justice's legal language would be placed under post-decision review. Are you certain, Congresswoman? Crockett. Not just certain, convinced. Barrett exhaled deeply. Welcome the scrutiny. It was as if time stopped. Reporters rushed outside, broadcasting the news. Barrett backs oversight on bench language. Judicial review to expand. Then Ellie Jung was called to speak. Her voice was firm. I participated in internal Sentinel meetings where legal analysts described Supreme Court language as their strategic sandbox. They saw rulings as flexible tools. This wasn't about justice, it was about power. It's by 9:30 a.m. global. Markets were reacting. Stocks tied to surveillance tech dropped. European data regulators called for a full review of all U.S.-linked digital networks. Meanwhile, within the chamber, Barrett stayed seated not as an untouchable symbol, but as a witness willing to face consequence. A final surprise came from an unlikely voice, Republican Senator Harold Eames, long a supporter of judicial insulation. This is not about ideology. This is about a branch of government drifting into abstraction while corporations build weapons from its words. I will co-sponsor the Judicial Commission. The room rippled. And then, without theatrics, the chairman simply said, "So ordered." Outside, the protest crowd erupted in cheers. For many, this was not just a policy shift, it was a psychological one. The idea that even the Supreme Court, long shielded from direct challenge, could now be part of a broader democratic check was electrifying. As Justice Barrett exited the building, flashbulbs flickered in a chaotic rhythm. She paused on the steps. Cameras caught the moment, her face calm, dignified, yet clearly changed. A journalist shouted, "Justice Barrett, do you regret the ruling?" She stopped walking. I regret the silence that followed it, and then she was gone. Later that evening, Crockett appeared on a special segment of CNN International. "We're not dismantling the court," she said. "We're illuminating it." Across the Atlantic, a French lawmaker tweeted, "Today, America showed that even power must bow to principle." By midnight, the phrase Black Echo had trended globally, but so had something else. Barrett Crockett Doctrine, a new legal framework where transparency, not assumption, would guide interpretation. History had changed in 7 days. Not because two powerful women clashed, but because one dared to speak and the other dared to listen.